No doubt you're going to see stories of tragedy and violence. In fact, in Paris, just horrific tragedy, and we should pray for them. But the perpetrators behind that crime are in many ways parallel to the Ninevites. In many ways, the people and the evil and the network behind it are parallel to the evil network of the Ninevites. And yet, Jonah tells us that we serve a God who's gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. I'm going to close with this story. In 1978, there was a man named Jeffrey Dahmer, and Jeffrey Dahmer, fun fact, as I'm Googling this, sort of from Medina. I didn't know that, but a little bit of pop culture that you don't want to know. So, 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer killed his first victim, and over the next 13 years, Jeffrey Dahmer would perpetuate a horrific string of violence, leaving victims from here to like Milwaukee in his wake, okay? And so, all told, Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 people that they know of, and I'm a little bit younger, so I sort of like, I know Jeffrey Dahmer, but I wasn't like really following the trial when I was 10. But, bad dude, okay? I read some of the stuff and I was like, man, this is not good. Which is, you should give me a golf clap for acknowledging that. But let's just say it was very heinous, okay? Even like the Wikipedia page of Jeffrey Dahmer, kind of, man, nasty stuff, okay? So anyway, Jeffrey Dahmer, he was finally penalized for his sins. He was finally caught, and he was arrested in 1991. And at first they charged him with like a couple killings, and it just kept coming out of the woodwork, literally, that there were like people all along in a string of crime. And so many people at the time, they wanted Jeffrey Dahmer to get capital punishment. They wanted Jeffrey Dahmer to die, to fry, to have the death penalty, whatever Ohio does. I didn't Google that. And much to everybody's dismay or surprise, he wasn't given the death penalty. He was just sentenced to life in prison. So in 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer, he goes to prison for 17 horrific and brutal murders. And when he's going into prison, he asked for a copy of the Bible from his arresting officer, the guy who arrested him, and the detective who took him in. And so he gets this Bible when he goes to prison, and he spends a lot of his time in solitary because he's a bad dude. And throughout that time, he's reading the Bible. And he begins interacting with the prison chaplain, or the pastor who was visiting the prison, and he began meeting with this guy pretty regularly. And so in 1994, 3 years after Jeffrey Dahmer's been incarcerated, he was baptized as a follower of Jesus. He was baptized as a Christian, as a believer. And many people, and I was too young to have been in this crowd necessarily, but I'm not saying I wouldn't have been. Many people said, "Oh, it's just a publicity stunt. It's just a guy trying like a last-ditch effort to get sympathy. You can't believe him. I mean, he's a psychopath. He's a serial killer. He's a mass murderer." And yet Jeffrey Dahmer was baptized. Several months later, in fact, ironically, after Jeffrey Dahmer's baptism, he was killed by another inmate. Another prisoner killed him. And at that time, much of the public outcry was like they were in favor of it. They were happy about it. Finally, he got what he deserved. He got justice. And my question to you is this. Do you worship a God whose grace is big enough to save even the most evil of men? Or is his grace only big enough to save you from your white-collar sins? And I'm assuming white-collar sins, okay? We'll talk about that later. But if one day when you get to heaven, if Jeffrey Dahmer is there, will you be angry and disgruntled and irate? How did he get in? What? He's Jeffrey Dahmer. Jesus, do you not know who this guy is? Don't you know what he did? Don't you have Google or Wikipedia? I was wasn't even alive, and I figured it out. I said, how did he get by? I'm not actually being like that for drama. My voice just went out for a second. Will you be indignant and self-righteous, or will you be joyous that God's grace is big enough for even the greatest of sinners? The Apostle Paul was a terrorist by all definitions. He was a man who had lived his life killing the early Christians. He sought out those who followed Jesus, and he put them to death. And yet God's grace was big enough for him. He redeemed him. He bought him back. And because of that, Jesus used the Apostle Paul to write much of the New Testament, to start the early church in many ways.